the Financial Times, and to, of course, Jean Pisani-Ferry, our Bruegel's former director, and, of course, the chief of program of Emmanuel Macron, who we are very happy to have him with us today. We will talk about the future of Europe after the French elections, and after the French election, and the way we thought we structured that discussion today is that I will ask Tony to kick it off and give us his take about what are going to be the main challenges that Europe is faced with in the next few years. We shouldn't take more than 5 to 10 minutes. Then I will turn to Jean to give his views. Then I will also speak a little bit, I guess, and I'm sure there will be some points on which I will want to react also and make my own points. And then we will have a little bit of a debate here on the podium, but also, of course, give you a chance to ask your questions and suggest ideas to all three of us. So perhaps without much further ado, the future of Europe is a big topic, has many dimensions, but certainly after the French elections, a lot of things look different than they looked before the French elections. So Tony, what would be your main points?
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I guess my first point would be that it's extremely presumptuous of me to say anything about what the French government and presidential program would be in the presence of Jean. But I maybe structure what I'm going to say into two parts. One is the initial domestic reaction in France to the election result, and one is the reaction on the wider European stage. The domestic reaction, of course, was one of mostly, I think, tremendous relief at the better-than-expected victory of Emmanuel Macron, and the fact that the way that Marine Le Pen flirted with the idea of altering France's place in the monetary union just fell apart, wasn't convincing at all, and most voters seem to see through that. One has seen, however, a certain hostility, I think, to the some of the economic reform proposals that have been aired during the campaign by the new president, and I think that needs watching pretty closely, because one needs to keep in mind that the first round result in France did show a very substantial vote for candidates who, for one end of the spectrum or the other, seemed not only very, very angry with the old political classes, but suspicious of what sort of reforms might be coming their way. On the European stage, I'd like to, I'm going to give you a little preview of something I hope to be published next Wednesday, I think, in the paper. I was struck by the contrast between two reactions. One was the almost lyrical, poetic reaction of Sylvie Goulard from the European Parliament, who talked about, at last, France and Europe reconciled, and here, at the Louvre, the place where the kings of France used to be, in comes this young president to the sound of the European Union anthem. It was very moving, the way she put it. But one mustn't forget that some hundreds of kilometers away in Warsaw, the reaction of the Polish head of state and the Polish government was extremely cool indeed. I mean, frankly, it could hardly have been more frosty. The president, Andrzej Duda, who of course comes from the same party, Law and Justice, as Jarosław Kaczynski and the government, only in the last few days before the second round vote last Sunday, had said, if Monsieur Macron wins and he expects Poland to trust France again, he's got a lot of work to do. So that made me think, whereas the reaction in Western Europe was overwhelmingly positive, and in the EU institutions, overwhelmingly positive, there were pockets of shall we say, reserve and skepticism. And I think that needs to be kept in mind, because one is in some danger, I think, of thinking just because a new impetus may be available now for a healthier Franco-German relationship and an impetus for the kind of strengthening of the Eurozone that everybody wants to see. That isn't the whole of the story. It goes as far as the European Union in its entirety is concerned. The risk of differences of opinion, indeed quite profound clashes between largely in Western Europe and some largely in the former communist world. This seems to me a very serious matter, and it won't go away because of Macron's victory. That needs to be kept in mind. I think I'll leave it there because time is short, but just a couple of ideas there.
Thank you for the warning. So, no time for celebration. Problems at home, problems in the rest of Europe, right? That's the short summary of what you said. Well, I think you're obviously right to sort of point to problems and potential difficulties. But let me say a few words, perhaps, on how I see the significance of this election. First of all, Macron has broken with a sort of long-standing, I'm taking the French perspective, has broken with a long-standing attitude of avoiding European issues in a presidential election. And that has been there for a very long time. Last time, perhaps, Europe was present and positively present in a presidential election that was in the 70s. Since then, or perhaps Mitterrand's second election in 88. At any rate, it's been a very long time. The reason being that because both main parties were divided about Europe, they avoided discussing the issue. That was more expedient to avoid speaking about Europe or beyond sort of semi-automatic statements. And this election was largely about Europe. I mean, the second round definitely was largely about Europe, and even the first round. And Macron didn't put the European flag in his pocket, as we say in French. So that has a significance. I think because of him, because of Le Pen, there is a significance that, I mean, domestically at least, breaks with a long-standing tradition. He has a mandate, anyway. At the same time, you're right to point out that there are divisions within the country. You're right to point out that being on a campaign trail, he listened to the part of France that is not comfortable at all with globalization, with European integration, with foreign competition. All that matters. And we saw in France exactly the same divide that we observed in the Brexit vote or in the US election. The divide by education level, the divide by location, and the divide, which was extremely striking, by personal perception about the future. I mean, the divide between the optimist and the pessimist. Everybody, including controlling for, let's sort of take for a second the sort of academic standpoint, controlling for all other variables, what in the end continues to matter is a personal perception of whether you're personally optimistic or personally pessimistic about the future. And this has to be addressed. I mean, you can't just say, I have a mandate from the side of France that is optimist, that feels well in Europe and the world. The France that's pessimistic about the future had a very bad champion. Had someone who didn't know how to explain how she would leave the Eurozone, started improvising about a dual currency system that was a recipe for disaster, and everybody perceived it as a recipe for disaster. Now the question is still there. So I think you should make no mistake about what Macron stands for. he's not going to just to speak for the happy France and rejoice and say those are, we're all happy and friends. He will be, because he's so committed, he also will be, demanding on ways domestically and ways at European level to respond to this fear, to this anger that was so much expressed in the electoral campaign. Now, on reforms and answering your 2 points. On reforms, the domestic response has to solve a sort of paradox. At the same time, there is reluctance to reform. It was expressed. And there is a strong camp that essentially expressed fear of change and a preference for the former status quo. And at the same time, we know that the status quo is unsustainable. That you're not going to, if we stay with that level of unemployment, if we stay with this divide between the larger cities and the smaller cities in the countryside, if we stay with problems of competitiveness, etc., it's not politically sustainable. So reforms are indispensable, and at the same time, political capital has to be invested wisely in reforms that are going to deliver, because that's essential in order to change the political equation. Put it differently, in France, as in other countries, the side that sees that openness, integration are the problems we've got to face, and they are stand against. They're going to have better champions. They had in several countries bad champions. They can have better champions. So the challenge is really, and I think the challenge for all of us, is to redefine the economic openness, redefine the open society and the open economy in a way that is politically sustainable. And I think that's a domestic challenge, and that's a European challenge. So the answer to your question is really invest political capital wisely in reforms that are going to deliver nationally and at European level. Now, on what you said about the attitude in some part of Europe, yes, we observe that. I think there are differences of situation. There are differences of preferences. There are also differences in values. And at some point, we have to raise a point. What are the fundamental values the EU is built on? And if we have differences about that, I think we have a serious problem to face. Because Europe is not a sort of cooperative of interest. It also built on values. And I think the fact that Macron got a mandate by campaigning on Europe, that was a significance also. That was because he was campaigning not to say just it's in our interest. It's also repeatedly said it is our values, it's what our continent brings to the world. And if some people consider that this is not their values, the values they stand for, I mean, we have a political problem in Europe, and we have to recognize that.
Okay, I think this was a good start. A lot of food for thought already. Perhaps let me talk about 3 points that, of course, figured very significantly in this debate, and that are more on the economic side. So one is the reform of France itself, which I think was very prominent in the debate, and Emmanuel Macron, of course, has put forward a very strong program. I think there's really two issues that are interesting here. One is about the shift in public finance and in the structure of public finance. If I read the program correctly, the idea is to reduce the size of the state. So currently the size is at 56%, government expenditures at 56%. The idea is to overall come to savings of up to 60 billion in the next 5 years, while at the same time increasing investment very significantly up to 50 billion. So we are talking here about a very significant shift in the structure of public finance of France, which I think will create a lot of interesting and complicated debates. Now, I think perhaps the one point where I guess I would sort of put a question, and I think both of you referred to this, is this country side city divide, which is sort of the regional urban divide that has been very visible in the British Brexit vote, but also very visible in the support for Marine Le Pen that was not in Paris but on the countryside. It seems to me that what Brexit was about was also a vote about rebalancing between London and the countryside. Mm-hmm. And paradoxically, even though the UK overall will lose from Brexit, there will be some rebalancing from London to the countryside, in the sense that London will do significantly worse than the countryside will do worse. So there's some, the relative gap is actually falling, even though it's a negative for everybody, to my mind. But it's the gap is falling. And I guess in France, my question would be, what kind of regional policies on regional community policies we can think of that would be supportive to employment on the countryside, not just to employment, but also to social cohesion, a feeling of inclusiveness also, quite frankly, because it's not just about money, it's really about feeling to be included, feeling to participate in society. I think it's a major question that has probably relatively little to do with the entire European agenda, but it's really an agenda that's very much a domestic policy agenda in France, and that I think is of absolutely fundamental importance. I guess then I come to the Eurozone.
Can we already discuss?
Sure. We can discuss one by one if you wish. Yeah, why not?
That would be,
please. Yeah,
sure. Okay, let me say something on public finances, because it's probably our mistake, but there has been a lot of confusion about this public finance strategy. Definitely, we share the observation that public spending is too high in France compared to what it delivers. It is structurally higher than in other countries, in many other countries, because we have a fully public pension system. We have a fully public healthcare system. We have a fully public education system. All that means that some of the roles that are fulfilled by the private sector are fulfilled by the public sector in France. That means higher spending, and this is not. I mean, you can have all sorts of debate about the relative merits of both systems, but sort of that's part of the social contract as it is. So, but. Efficiency has to be improved, definitely. There are layers of public administration, and that adds to public spending. And there has been a tendency to use public spending as a substitute for some better functioning markets. I mean, be it for housing market or for labor market, etc. So definitely, the goal is, the objective, the target is to reduce public spending significantly. By 60 billion, so 3 percentage points of GDP. I'm not speaking of the cyclical dimension. The cyclical dimension would add to that, but I'm speaking of the structural reduction in public spending, about 3 percentage points of GDP. Now, that's for the end year. I mean, at the end of the term. At the end of the term, en route to a lower spending level. But the sort of intermediate target is 60 billion reduction. Now, we are starting from a situation, as we all know, of extremely low interest rate. Mm-hmm. And our perception, our view, is that this is not something permanent, but it's something that may last for some time. And even though interest rates are now higher than they were a year ago, they're still extremely low in real terms compared to grow. So it's a moment where you would wish to use this window to invest, and to invest including to reduce public spending structurally. So to have an approach of public spending that's not just sort of trying to contain but trying to restructure, attempting to restructure. And that implies investment. That implies digital investment, that implies investment in the restructuring of the health sector. This implies investment in training so that people are better prepared and you spend less on labor market programs, on passive labor market policies, etc. So that's what I meant. And the 50 billion is not a permanent reshuffling of public spending, a reallocation to investment. That's the total of what's going to be spent on investment over the term. Okay? So that's the strategy. Now, we may go back to your point, but maybe Tony will want to react.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, first of all, I hope I didn't sound too negative in my opening remarks, because after all, let's be honest. If you can't feel positive about an election result like this, when are you ever going to feel positive about anything in Europe? So, no, I am. Of course, I want to look on the bright side. Very brief, two thoughts. One, how long will the Macron honeymoon last? I mean, if you look at previous presidents after they got elected, you know, since Chirac at least, the honeymoon seems to get a bit shorter each time. And it was very short in the case of François Hollande. So I worry a bit there. It seems to me that the reform programme has to start quite soon, given the relatively favourable backdrop, the monetary policy backdrop of the ECB and the general economic headwinds and so on. The second point is I've heard some talk that the new president might try to ram through some of these reforms, bypassing the National Assembly, by doing something by decree. I mean, obviously, one can't be sure about that until we know the composition of the lower house of Parliament. But this was done a little bit during the Hollande presidency, as I'm sure you'll all remember. That worries me a little bit. I think legitimacy depends on doing things the way people are used to. But it may not turn out that way, of course.
Okay, let me perhaps go back to your previous point, the regional dimension.
That would be interesting,
Well, if you look at, there was a very interesting, very good map of the French outcome in the FT the day after the election, where you see basically two things. You see the northeast-southwest divide. Northeast voted more for Le Pen, southwest voted more for Macron, which is exactly the map of the sort of traditional manufacturing, the Rust Belt, let's use the US image, versus the new growth, sort of Lorraine versus Toulouse, right? So that's very, very clear. And then the second thing you're seeing is that the larger cities was overwhelmingly voted for Macron, and the smaller city and part of the country. The countryside is not even, but in smaller cities, many that see no future and voted for Le Pen because they don't see any future for themselves. And I think that's exactly what we saw in the US or in the UK. That's basically the same. So it's a problem to all of us. It's the inclusiveness in an economy of agglomeration that puts such a premium on agglomeration, on skilled people. I mean, the syndrome in France is like everywhere. You're getting a university degree, you leave your small town, you're joining a vibrant city, and people who are left out, they're lost, and they feel that they have no future. Now, the answer to that, I mean, we have some, but it's limited. The answer to that, in part, it's tax policy. So a tax policy that somehow redresses that, and that's a reform of the housing tax that is on the program. Part of it is more important, is making sure everybody's got access to education, the basic public services in the same way, and that's far from being the case. The chances of upward mobility, depending on where you're born, are not the same. So at least ensuring that individually it does not affect your upward mobility. Part of it is the functioning of the housing market. Part of it is, but part of it is obviously the digitalization. I mean, the access to high-speed internet, mobility policies for mobility. So there are policies, and those policies have to be implemented. Now, are these policies going to be sufficient? I think that's a big challenge for all of us. Briefly, on the honeymoon, let's assume there will be no honeymoon. That's safer. The reason that would make me more optimistic is the clarity of what has been said during the campaign. Because very often in France, you had people who campaigned on one side and governed on the other side. So they said, I'm going to distribute, and they came to power and started taxing. And that's not the kind of thing that is a very good start, and you basically immediately burn a lot of political capital, and rightly so. And I think on this case, I think Macron put forward the reform in the campaign. So people already oppose, people already warn that they're going to be opponents, but at least there is clarity. So that's the thing. On the decree laws, well, it's not, we're a parliamentary democracy. So there is a procedure that makes it possible for Parliament to give a mandate to government to pass what we call ordonnance, sort of decrees, on specified reforms or topics. And then they have to be approved by Parliament afterwards. Okay? So it's a sort of, what it limits is the right of amendment of Parliament on the decrees, but obviously it's a parliamentary procedure and has been used repeatedly throughout the recent times, history of recent times. So it's not something that, and it's not something certainly that prevents discussing and consulting on the content of those decrees. So it's when you want to go relatively quickly and introduce a package of reform, that's something that is usable and has been used.
Okay, perhaps we can move to the European discussion, because now we talked a lot about France, which I think is very important because France is, of course, a major part of Europe. But let's also talk a bit about the European dimension of the program. I think one interesting dimension, there are many interesting dimensions, but one which is probably less controversial is the one about creating agencies to protect European companies from foreign investment out of security concerns. I think this is a debate that is ongoing. The United States has already an institution called CFIUS that allows the United States government to prohibit a foreign takeover of a company if vital security interests are concerned. We do not have anything comparable at the European level. Some countries have it, and I do think that sort of moving forward on that in a joint manner, if designed well, certainly makes sense. There's also some adjustment on trade policies that is demanded, which I think will be controversially discussed. Of course, there was one line which I found a bit surprising, which was this buying Europe line. So public procurement, a certain percentage, if I understand correctly, a certain percentage of public procurement should go to companies from Europe, which I think will create some debate, but probably it's just the reality that is there anyway. Now, I think the most interesting and the most controversial part of his program is, of course, the Eurozone discussion and the proposal to create a Eurozone budget with a Euro area finance minister and a Euro area parliament, with the aim to be able to invest more than currently. That's the quote from the program. Now, we've already seen, you refer to Poland, but we've already, of course, seen very negative reactions from the country that I know best. And I think the reactions, to some extent, I have to say, I was a bit surprised by these reactions, because basically this is very general, what is in there. So I think it's not very clearly spelled out. And certainly in the program, there's no mentioning of Eurobonds, but everybody in Germany seemed to already think this is the start of Eurobonds in Europe, and was already preemptively saying, even though nobody apparently said it, preemptively saying we don't want it, which I think was a bad way of starting that new relation. But that's where we are, and I think this will be one of the big and the major debates that will define certainly the presidency of Emmanuel Macron, also because he has campaigned so much on this European topic. Now, I think there's lots of questions what this budget should do, how it should be organized, what it should achieve. There's lots of challenges. I think it's clear that it's very difficult to think of a size of a budget that would be so significant that it would solve the kind of regional problems that we discussed initially in France. So I think this is not sort of, I don't think many people would think that the Eurozone budget will be an instrument to solve major regional divergences in the member states of the Eurozone. But I think people do think about this as an insurance mechanism for large shocks. People have views on this about what could be done to bolster investment. And the most controversial part would be certainly how this instrument would be used for debt management in case things go really bad in some states. And there's the sort of how this interacts with the European stability mechanism. I think is certainly one of the big questions. I think all of this will need to be discussed, and so far isn't spelled out. I'm not sure whether Jean now wants to spell it out. I guess there's still a lot of thinking also ongoing on the details of what can be proposed. But certainly I would be curious to hear also, Tony, your reaction and Jean, your reaction on that topic.
My first thought is that these ideas about some even if limited, Eurozone budget, finance minister, and Eurozone Parliament, I mean, they've been kicking around quite a long time and never really got anywhere at all. And I could be wrong, but I didn't get the feeling that in the Macron program, these were really central proposals that he was really intent on pushing forward at the earliest opportunity with Germany and others. But I could be wrong. The question, of course, is whether the German government put together after the Bundestag election in September will look on proposals like this with favour. And as Guntram suggested, I mean, I wouldn't say there's kind of unanimous scepticism. I mean, but it does seem to me that there is a general sense that we have to see whether the reform process is taking off in France before we consider, not before we consider perhaps, before we actually do things. It might make a difference if the Social Democrats don't do well in the Bundestag elections and play some sort of minor role in yet another grand coalition or even in opposition. And looking at the recent Land elections in Saarland and Schleswig-Holstein and what may well happen in Nordrhein-Westfalen, I think you've got to say the chances of the SPD being in a position where they could mould a more favourable German coalition attitude towards some of these proposals that were in the Macron programme. It doesn't at the moment. That doesn't look too likely. But we're still 4 months from the election, so we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, perhaps I should say that this is a moment to advertise Bruegel research, because basically what we're going to discuss has been covered extensively, including the very first one you mentioned, this oversight of foreign investment in Europe, which was outlined in a paper by Nicolas Véron and Lars-Henrik Koller back in 2008, 2009. The idea is very much the same, is to say at European level and not, there's so much, let's say, there's so much capital ready to be invested that this question of attitude of government versus vis-a-vis foreign investment is bound to, arise at some point. Let's have a framework in place at European level that would be safer. On the Eurozone. Well, on the Eurozone, there might be a translation problem. I checked my French-German dictionary, and the translation for budget doesn't seem to be Eurobonds in it. Huh?
No, exactly.
So I don't understand. There's something going wrong with the translation. Now, seriously, I think you said there might be and there might be reactions that are reserved, negative vis-a-vis some proposal. I don't think we need to agree on everything. We need a serious conversation. I mean, can we be happy with the fact that the Eurozone is still there? We can be happy. With the way it works, with the way some of the problems have been addressed, with the way we do contingency planning with respect to what can happen, be it another type of country-specific crisis, be it how we manage the next recession, be it the sort of overall balance of activity and the flow of savings and investment. Can we be happy? I don't think we can be very proud of the outcome, right? Can we be happy that there are still banking problems around, whereas the US addressed its banking problems back in 2009? No. So I think we need sort of a serious discussion, not on what's feasible immediately, on what's a sort of easy harvest of things on which we agree. What is needed is a serious discussion on what are the remaining shortcomings and what are the options. And there can be disagreements, there can be different preferences. But in the past, when we built the euro, it was not that we spontaneously agreed on what had to be done. It was that there was a genuine discussion on what are the conditions for going forward. And I think what has lacked in recent years is this kind of discussion. So there has been a lot of crisis management, decision taken at the last minute, just before something really bad could happen. But we have lacked this serious discussion. The Commission has put forward some ideas. Think tanks have put forward many ideas. Those need to be taken on board, and needs to, I think everybody needs to understand better what the preference of the others and what are the red lines. I mean, speaking on the French side, the French government have been saying for 25 years that we need an economic government. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Does it mean something clear to people in this room who are probably better informed than many other people? No, and that's our fault, because French government have used a sort of language in lieu of serious proposal. And I think that's what we should end. We need to have much more serious, much more precise discussion, and that may mean disagreement, but disagreement can be solved if you're serious about the discussion.
If I could just come back to this point about Eurobonds. I mean, of course, it wasn't in the electoral program, Mr. Macron, but it's possible that what some people saw was an interview that he gave. I mean, certainly I can recall the one in the FT. I think it was in 2015, and he talked in rather general terms about well, of course, in a currency union, you have to have some sort of ability of the stronger, better off areas to assist the less well off areas. That's not necessarily Eurobonds, but it's not. It doesn't say Eurobonds, but possibly that sowed a seed in the way people thought about this subject.
Okay, perhaps I open up and get some questions. I think you've heard a lot about France, about Europe. I think there will be many questions. So let me take always three, if that's okay for you. So the gentleman here, the lady there, and the lady there. So I take the center block first. Centrist questions, please.
Thank you. Thomas Leyton from the... Is on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Thomas Lauritsen from the Danish newspaper Politiken. I'd like to pick it up on what you were just talking about on the Eurozone reforms. To put the question more straight, what will Mr. Macron, what will President Macron be needing from Chancellor Merkel when he goes to Berlin? What kind of flexibility?
You can pass to your colleague, your neighbor.
Hi, I'm Heidi Jensen from Jyllands-Posten, also Denmark. You seem to imply, well, you talked about the EU also being a union of values. You almost seem to imply that some countries shouldn't be in the union if they didn't share those values. Could you just expand on that, perhaps? Thank you.
Okay, so with the lady in front, yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Leana Wissole. I work for the European Commission on Migration and Home Affairs. Mr. Pisani-Ferry, you talked about openness. I wanted to ask, what do you think Emmanuel Macron is going to do about openness of borders in the terms of the state of emergency and so on? Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, let me answer the first question first by saying that, we're perfectly conscious that the agenda starts at home with solving homegrown problems with domestic policies. I mean, there is no attitude of telling neighbors or telling partners that they should be solving our problems. It's simple, but has to be said. What I said about this conversation is that, again, France and Germany, for the reason we know, that they have different attitudes, that they have a sort of historical role, but also because they have quite different attitudes towards a number of problems, have the responsibility of addressing them and mapping out the agenda. So I think that's what needed. Now, this discussion, France is just out of an electoral campaign. Germany starts an electoral campaign. There's a sort of small disconnect between the two in terms of the timing. I think the discussion after the German electoral campaign is over, you have two governments in place. Time should not be lost, but the conditions for a serious discussion to take place need to be there. You need to know, obviously, with whom you're going to speak, what is the position of the government, and if it requires some patience, so be it. I mean, it's not, but has to be. Has to take place when conditions are there. On the countries, on the values, I just said, the obvious, that we have a Charter of Fundamental Rights, that we have values, that we stand for, as Europeans in the world, for the freedom of expression, for university freedom, for attitudes towards minorities, all sorts of minorities. Those are part of our core values. And I think we have to be serious about these values, because you're not going even to tell your own citizens that Europe means something if you're telling them, Europe is just about interest. If you're telling them Europe is just about interest, you're sending a message in terms of democracy, in terms of what we think we are in this world. That's a very negative message. So I think we have a responsibility vis-à-vis ourselves, but also vis-à-vis our citizens, to stand for values. And if we disagree about fundamental values, I mean, this has to be said, and this has to be
discussed.
I mean, discussed. I'm not saying countries have no. It is not the place to be within the EU, but I'm saying that it's not either or. I mean, it has to be part of the discussion. Finally, on openness and if I understood correctly, you spoke about the sort of the security and the there was this debate with Mrs. Le Pen wanted to sort of close border and saying security is about closing border, which is completely absurd, because you're not going to ensure security by putting border guards every 5 kilometers, and you don't have enough border guards. I mean, security, and this is possible with the Schengen system, has to be strengthened, obviously, but that's compatible, and we can make it compatible with the mobility of people and without the sort of closing of borders. And I don't think in terms of efficiency, the solution of closing borders is a better one.
Just on this point about values, I find the whole discussion of this extremely disturbing, actually. I think it carries the potential to be very, very divisive. If it were simply a case of here are the EU's democratic principles and values, and here's somebody not respecting those principles and values, then yes, we could all see where we stand. The trouble is, there are grey areas. I mean, looked at from Prague or Bratislava or Bucharest or Budapest or Warsaw, it doesn't look quite that straightforward. It looks as if there are certain issues about what kind of society we are, what kind of civilization we stand for. I'm not trying to defend a lot of what the leaders of those countries do and say. Certainly not, this silly phrase, illiberal democracy, and threatening the Central European Union. God, no, not defending any of that. But I'm saying that you can't isolate democratic principles of this open society, I think, from other issues that are of great concern to the societies in that part of Europe. And the danger of this evolving into a, Syria A and Syria B type of view is definitely there. And I don't think that would be good.
Right.
Sorry, just to react to that, I do agree that we have to recognize that histories are not, recent histories are not the same, that there can be different attitudes, but I'm just saying that there is a core of fundamental values we should all, accept and consider part of the sort of DNA of the EU. And actually, it is part of the DNA because it is in the treaty.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's the treaty.
It is.
I mean, I
is
think you
I'm
have
not
to take the
treaty.
treaty.
It's not beyond the treaty.
You have to take the treaty base, and the treaty base says things about the rule of law, about the importance of constitutional courts, about the importance of freedom of press. And I think those. Now, then there's a different value debate, which is ongoing, which is sort of, is Europe Christian or not, which is different, but that's not, I think that goes beyond the treaty and is a different debate, really.
The trouble is it all gets infected with party politics, as we see every time the European People's Party meets.
Right. Okay, so let me take a few more questions. So I see that André has a question, then the gentleman there, and then the gentleman all the way in the back.
A question about flexi-security. I'm delighted that the new president is endorsing this idea, the Scandinavian model. I think that is indeed much welcome. But I want to raise an issue about sequencing. Is there a danger, and how to avoid this danger? I mean, that's what I'm looking for. How to avoid the danger that what would be enacted during the summer in the manner that was discussed before would be the flexibility part, and that the security will take much, much longer. And therefore that we are going to go for not a balanced approach of, and he has been very clear in the campaign that he wants both. And I think the flexi security is indeed a balance between the two. But as we know, the security is not straightforward. It's not legislating a change in the labor code. It's much more complicated. It also involves money, and it will involve reform, including of the education system. So how can one avoid this sequencing problem and doing the security much later and getting a lot of problem for that?
Okay, gentleman there.
Thank you. Christopher Strzemka, Polish Press Agency. One more question about the values. Do you think that the European Union has sufficient tools to protect its values? Because we've been
sufficient tools, whether the European Union has
Can
sufficient
you
tools.
speak up a bit?
Yeah, do you think that the European Union has sufficient tools to protect its values? Because we've been in discussions, for instance, about the Poland in the rule of law procedure for a while, but it seems that for the Polish authority, it doesn't mean a lot. So do you think that we need another maybe tools, legal tools to protect values of the European Union? Thank you.
Okay. Then there's the gentleman all the way in the back.
Rory McInnes-Gibbons, Durham University. The country have had enough of academics. I just wanted to quote one of the leading engineers of Brexit. I just wanted to know, I suppose a question directly addressed to Jean, and I'm sure you've covered some of it in a few of your answers, but how does Macron avoid, I don't want to use the term pejoratively, but being too much of a think tank? Like, how is he going to relate to, say, the workers of Whirlpool or the individuals who do not profit from the system at the moment? And how is he going to avoid this kind of populist surge that could or could not envelop him? I don't want to be too negative here, but I just wanted to say, how do we change the attitude to academics and think tanks more generally?
Right. Okay, these are very diverse questions. Very diverse questions, but I mean, Tony, perhaps you want to go first or this time, or on some of them?
I was rather hoping I could listen to Jean, flex security.
Okay, let me take it. Well, first of all, what's a sort of, let's take a step back, and what's the goal? No? The sort of Danish flex security model is an inspiration, but at the same time, there is more to it nowadays. What's in it nowadays is that the economy is transforming, in that the sort of traditional labor contract-based flex security is not a full answer to the problem of today. The problem of today is that the borders between independent and dependent work are being blurred. That lots of people move from being wage earners to becoming independent and vice versa, or both at the same time. That you have very short contract. I mean, the protections. I think the goal today should be to build protection for the gig economy, and that means more flexibility, more freedom, more initiative, but at the same time, protection that are better suited to protecting all people in activity. So our system, and that's the case in Bismarckian systems in general, is based on silos. So you have the silo of wage earners, you have the silo of public employees, and you have the silo of independent people. And they have different systems for protection, for pension, The thing is that if, and I think it's both happening, but it's also desirable, if the society is evolving in the direction of having less silo, more mobility across sector, more mobility across different status, then you have to rethink social protection. And it means it needs to be more individualized. It needs to be more centered on the individual, and the individual as he or she moves from one sector to another. It has to be much more portable and much more universal. So I think that's the goal. And that's the inspiration behind the reform of the unemployment insurance system that is going to be universal, become universal, and the inspiration behind the reform of the pension system, ending the fact that your pension is calculated based on different principles depending on where you are, and with a lot of actually inequality that, if you change sector at one point of your career or another point of your career, it changes, or if you go in one direction or the other direction, it changes almost at random, the benefit you're going to get when you're a pensioner. So those are very fundamental reforms, and they go, it's sort of a system that needs to be rebuilt. And again, we can take inspiration from the 20th century, the better 20th century social protection system, but also we need to think about the 21st century protection. Now, the sequencing, some of these reforms take time. Pension takes time. Takes time because introducing such a comprehensive reforms, you need to work out, all the implication, not only for broad categories, for almost at individual level, to understand who are going to be potential winners, potential losers, how to address that, etc., how to sort of organize a convergence towards new rule, etc. So that's bound to take time. Now, on unemployment insurance, I think we can go much quicker, so that you address at the same time the flexibility dimension and the protection dimension. That's the sort of sequencing we have in mind. But I agree. I take your point. I mean, that in general, that it's not. I mean, you can. As always, you can use political capital to push reforms that are not popular because they're important and they will deliver in the medium term. But at the same time, you have to take care of what the perception of your agenda and the perception of Macron's agenda in part of the population is certainly negative. I mean, they feel it as a destruction of traditional protection, not as much as a rebuilding of new protection. So for them, it's very important to give the signal that it's not a sort of traditional liberalization agenda and which is based on dismantling protections, building also new protections that are more effective.
Perhaps,
yes, perhaps on that.
Perhaps let me just add on the flex security aspect two considerations. I think the first is that when you change a system, a protection system, I think it's typically good to do it in an upswing and not in the downswing, because if you do it in the downswing, you lose the protection and you have not yet built the new security legs. And I think the good moment.
You're speaking of employment protection, especially
of labor protection, employment protection. And I think the good moment in France is that this is in an upswing, and so in an upswing, it doesn't. It doesn't feed into unemployment because there's new jobs being created. That's perhaps the first observation. And the second observation is I think that this kind of flexicurity model and the way Jean has described it, I think very much captures the modern reality of labor markets. And I have to say, when I see what Labour in the UK is now proposing, labor market reforms that look very much like the 70s and 80s reforms. And even if I listen, to Martin Schulz, who talks about undoing some of the Hartz reforms, instead of talking more about the new elements, the flexicurity elements, how to deal with the digital economy, I think I was quite worried by both developments. And I do think that the right approach is to recognize the new reality of the labor market, which I think Jean's doing. Tony?
No, those are very good points. To move on, the question about does the European Union have the tools to protect its values? Well, I guess what we're really talking about here is how far do you go, how much pressure do you put on a government that is pursuing what one regards as objectionable policies or policies that are in contravention of EU values. Well, I was recently in Berlin and I talked about this with some members of the Bundestag, and I didn't hear one voice say Germany should support threats against Poland. I mean, it's close to unthinkable in the same way that one can't imagine Germany taking an actively negative or in terms of real material policy against Israel. You just can't do it. There's no appetite for it. Yes, of course, one can voice some criticisms, but actual, some Article 7 or something like this, I just don't see that happening. One can recall that largely thanks to Jacques Chirac in late 99, early 2000, there was an attempt to isolate Austria after the inclusion of the Freedom Party in the coalition government in Vienna. And I mean, the reaction of Austrian society to this was, who the hell are these people to tell us what we should we should form our government. I mean, even people who hadn't voted for the Freedom Party.
But if I may, I mean, I had recently a chat with a few senior Austrians who were complaining bitterly that the EU was tough on them, but is now not tough on Poland.
Well, there you go.
So unequal treatment, that's what they thought.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, do you want to take the one on the sort of academic and how to connect to people, or?
Well, it's a question to you, right? I'm not in an academic capacity here.
Okay.
No. The thought, I mean, you referred to this, moment in the campaign where Macron was, engage angry workers about their job being actually outsourced or delocalized to Poland, actually. And it's always important, I mean, for politicians to be confronted to reality, to anger, to despair. And what he told them is, I'm not here to say, here is a solution, I'm going to prohibit this delocalization, or I'm going to invent a new company that's going to take over. I'm not going to nationalize the company so that the state is going to start producing dryers. So, speaking the truth is important, and I think that was a moment when, in the debate, it was recognized that he was neither pandering to sort of, people demanding solution for themselves without, he was not a demagogue. And at the same time, he was not indifferent, and he engaged with them, and he spent hours with them discussing. And, that's a sort of formative moment for a future president, that you're not going to forget what happened at the time. And the type of solution we all know, they're not ready-made. They're not things you can just bring and telling people, here's a solution to your problem. I mean, it's a matter of economic development. It's a matter of skills. It's a matter of competitiveness of various locations. So you've got to go back to the sort of policy drawing board, but being informed by the social reality you've seen.
I wonder whether this has also got something to do with presidential image and behavior in France. I mean, one of the things that undermined the Sarkozy presidency and the Hollande presidency early on was the sense the public got that there were certain kind of quirks or shortcomings or errors in personal behavior, and that kind of damaged, I think, the effort to sell policies to the public.
Okay, let me take a few more questions. So I have Gregory, you, and I think you were first. So Gregory.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Jean. I understand that you don't want to give too much detail on the French position about the Euro governance, but you talked about red lines, and it appears that we all know about what the German red line is, so Eurobonds. But what will be the French red line in your view at the moment? Is it the restructuring mechanism? Is it the zero risk weight for sovereign exposure for bank? What can you already tell us a bit more about what will be the French red lines?
Okay.
Thank you. It's Donald Ricketts from Fleishman Hillard. I just wanted to go back on something Guntram spoke about earlier, vis-à-vis the urban rural divide, and something which also connects up with the values point we were just discussing, which is the upcoming negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, because essentially that goes to the heart of that question when you think about rural policy, what happens to the common agricultural policy, but equally cohesion funding. And we're talking about whatever it is, 13.5%, which may not be there in the future, we don't know, net 7-8% of the budget. And the question of whether that will be filled, if it won't. And Tony, you were referring to the fact that there is no prospect of threats coming from Berlin, but there is also very open talk of contingency that the payments, cohesion payments, will be contingent on compliance with solidarity, European norms, country-specific recommendations. So how do we navigate what is an extremely challenging question which puts in the crosshairs the urban-rural divide, but also current tensions between different views of European values?
Kurt Geisert, Association of European SMEs. I have a question for both speakers. Do you think that the pro-European direction of President Macron will lead to an attitude to try to keep the United Kingdom and the European Union together as closely as possible, for example, by one way of a customs union or so? Thank you.
Okay. Shall we take perhaps one or two more questions, and then let me take 2 or 3 more questions, and then we close the questions. So we have the gentleman there in the back, then the gentleman here. So there in the back, Bryn.
Hello, my name is Silas Stanif. I work with the Bulgarian newspaper Capital. During the campaign, there was a lot of talk about social dumping and fiscal dumping. I just wonder what this will take in, what will be the practical actions of the new French president. Is it a new type of actions like the directive for the posted workers, or we'll try something else? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So then here, sorry, I should group them.
Markus Preis, ARD, German TV. I'd like you to be more specific on the Eurozone budget. Sorry, could you just give us first a dimension? What are we talking about? Are we talking about $1 billion a year or 25? Second, where does the money come from? Is it contribution from the Eurozone countries, or is it a European tax? I don't know. And third, can you tell us what can be funded out of a Eurozone budget that cannot be funded by national governments or from the EU budget? Thank you.
Very concrete and practical questions. And I think there was a gentleman here. And is there a last question by someone that I could take? So then you have the last question.
My name is Jutaro Kaneko, Japan Center for International Finance. I'd like to ask Mr. Pisani-Ferry on French future position on banking union project. As an analogy to Mr. Macron's pro-EU stance, can we estimate that France will be supportive for risk sharing, including EDIS common scheme for deposit insurance scheme? Thank you very much.
All right, so the easy questions at the end, Jean. So
let me perhaps group the questions on the Eurozone at the end. So on first on the EU budget. That was how. No, I just tried to compute. It was 14 years ago that with André Sapir, under the leadership of André Sapir, I participated in a report that said the EU budget is a relic, historical relic, and still is. So there is something quite fundamental going on with Brexit, because the UK has been such a significant participant in the discussion in the EU budget, not always for the better, I would say, because UK introduced this principle of juste retour, which is a sort of very narrow angle to look at the budget, and basically everybody has adopted it.
And they were a net contributor, which is also.
And they were a net contributor. So there's a question with, what are the consequences of Brexit, of this new reality, for the way we consider the EU budget? And I think that's a discussion that should not be missed. Last time, for the multi-annual framework, the discussion that was expected to take place interfered with the debate on the Lisbon Treaty. And this discussion did not take place. Now, I think it should take place because, we're speaking of a changing economy. We're speaking of a changing geography of the EU, where all that at some point requires being translated into budget priorities. If we don't, we're making a joke of having a budget that does not correspond to the needs of today and just embodies the EU economy of the 80s, because that's basically what it is at present. So I think we shouldn't miss this opportunity. Second, on Macron and Brexit, I'm surprised this question came up so late in the discussion. I mean, as we're in a phase of the discussion on Brexit, which is a sort of very intensively dominated by the calculation of interest on both sides. Okay. Everybody has his or her own responsibility vis-à-vis his or her country in defending national interest. The 27 are unanimous on some red lines, let's use the word. And I don't think Macron will depart from this consensus of the 27. Now, longer term, we should think on also making sure that the partnership that will eventually be built is something that's beneficial, or at least does not destroy too much prosperity on both sides. And I think that's a sort of longer-term view we need to take. But at present, we're very much in a discussion which there is a sort of zero-sum game dimension, and that inevitably puts each and every one in a certain corner, and actually the 27 in the same corner. On social dumping, posted labor, essentially. Posted labor, the principle of it, I think, makes more sense than the way it is implemented. It has been implemented in a way that does not ensure that someone employed as a posted worker actually is a posted worker, first of all. That it's not a sort of way to circumvent the employment of people who are sort of permanent residents, they are not posted. Mm-hmm. And second, that he or she is employed actually at a level corresponding to the skill level and within the framework of labor laws that are the labor laws of the country. So a lot is about implementation. If we're not able to ensure proper implementation, the complaints about unfair social competition will remain, will grow, and eventually will destroy the mobility of people. So I think it's a serious matter. We have to take it seriously, because you cannot tell people, that's the rules, but the rules are not really applied. But you on your side, you have to apply to abide by the rules. That's just not sustainable. Do you want to react to that before we move
perhaps
to
just
move on?
to add, I mean, we had a piece with Clemens Fuest of the IFO Institute, Agnès Benassi of the French Council of Economic Advisors, and Vincent OCU, in which we very much emphasized this point about non-compliance with the rules, and how to improve that compliance with the rules is actually there. And I think really that's a significant part of the problem. And I think there are modern tools of dealing with quite a bit of that. I mean, that includes the issues around, how do you ensure that the reporting is actually transparent, which you can do a lot with just modern electronic means instead of having old-fashioned paper versions of, your permit to work and so on. So I think a lot can be done within the existing legal framework with better implementation. And I would agree with Jean that if that doesn't happen, I think the pressure to limit labor mobility that was a major factor in the UK, of course, but that pressure is going to be in the very core of the EU, and it's going to increase very significantly. So I think addressing that certainly is a major issue. Perhaps let me also say one point on Brexit, perhaps just to sort of complement the way I would see that. I think part of the toughness of the reaction on both sides is related to the insecurity of each side in their own position. So Theresa May had to take a very tough line because she very much depended on keeping the majority in the House of Commons. And the EU, I think, in some extent, has taken, on some dimensions, very tough positions because it is fearing about its internal unity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think, in a sense, what Emmanuel Macron changes in this is that the EU can be a little bit more confident about its own future. It's not that we have all countries at the door wanting to leave the European Union. And I think after the parliamentary election in the UK, the British government may also feel a little bit more secure, so that perhaps we may end up with this very antagonistic zero-sum game that we are discussing currently, gradually being softened and starting to focus also on the more forward-looking part, which is the future relation. But Tony, perhaps you want to also say something on Brexit?
First of all, on the EU budget, I'd like to strongly endorse everything Jean said. I mean, this is at the heart of the EU's future, really, the fact that you have a budget completely skewed in the wrong directions. I mean, where is the spending on internal security, external border security, business innovation? I mean, it's hardly to be seen, and it's. But of course, this issue is red hot. A real radical restructuring of the EU budget is terribly, terribly difficult to do because, as time has passed, it's turned into this standoff between net contributors and net beneficiaries. And again, this blends into what I was saying earlier about the risk of divisions appearing with geographical divisions appearing within the EU, because to the extent that you squeeze funds for countries that have been benefiting from regional aid and so on, this is going to antagonize them a lot. On Brexit and the specific question of could some eventual deal involve customs union, I mean, the first thing is you'd have to have a British government that actually asked for that. And right now, it doesn't look like, they're sort of, I'm not sure maybe they hide their sophisticated knowledge of the subject, but at the moment, it doesn't look like they completely understand what's involved. So I think Guntram makes a very good point about the risk that you would see some domino effect from Brexit. I mean, this doesn't look like this is going to happen at all. Therefore, a more pragmatic, enlightened approach could evolve over time. But you may well see a reshuffle of the British government as well after the election, and one or two figures who've achieved fame for all the wrong reasons might not be in that government.
All right. Jean, did you want to?
Right. No, something on just a word on the posted labor, because what's at stake is a single market. Huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what's at stake is sort of very concrete issues of efficiency. I recently spoke to Airbus people, and they told me when they had problem with this A380s, like about 10 years ago, there was a sort of misunderstanding between the German and the French side and on cables and that. They had 2,000 German people coming over to Toulouse to fix the problem, and that was essential for them. That's how they fix the problem. They moved the German labor force. I mean, the workers. I mean, the engineers. They moved all of them to Toulouse to work for 6 months there and to fix the problem. And you're not going to manage an integrated economy if you start putting brakes everywhere. So it's essential that we have a proper functioning, that it's not abused, but that it's kept. On the Eurozone, so the red lines, I have three red lines: complacency, inaction, and dogmatism. Right? So,
excellent.
No, that's no. What I mean, again, we need to start not from instruments, and that's also an answer to what you said about banking union. We need to start from the functions. What's needed? what are the issues we've got to solve? There's an issue of investment, there's an issue of stabilization, there's an issue of risk management. And it's not complicated. We just have to think about what can happen. Because the ECB is not going to be there for forever with just throwing money at problems. I mean, how do we deal with the next recession? How do we deal with a particular issue arising in a particular country? And how do we deal with the sort of the executive dimension? I think it's Nicolas Véron who wrote about the executive deficit when everybody was saying there is a democratic deficit. He said also there is an executive deficit in the Eurozone. So I think we've got to start not from the instruments on which you can immediately disagree, but we've got to start about the problem. Then the Eurozone budget can be part of the toolkit. Now, what exactly it is, what role it fulfills, depend on the balance between the way a budget, which in a way can be substituted. I mean, in stabilization, there is substitution between what you do at national level, what you do at Eurozone level. In terms of risk management, there is substitution between what you do through providing assistance and what you do through mitigating, reducing the risk in the first place. So those are issues on which you got to start from, again, I mean, an assessment, a diagnosis, an anticipation of what can go wrong, and then outline solutions.
So I'm sure we at Bruegel, we will contribute to that debate, continue to contribute to that debate, and provide some ideas and some food for thought of what are the key issues that need to be discussed and need to be discussed. And there I would totally agree with Jean, that need to be discussed seriously. I mean, we need to have a serious debate about this, that it's not just a dogmatic debate, but a serious debate. I think time is over, so please join me in thanking both Tony and Jean for their contribution today to this Financial Times Bruegel Second Economic Forum. Thank you.